The entire story of the Roman Empire, from 7 hills to eternal ruin. Before the world had countries as we understand them. Before there were languages we would recognize, codes of law we would call familiar, or roads connecting distant cities. There were 7 hills beside a muddy river in central Italy. Nothing about that place suggested destiny. The river flooded unpredictably. The hills were modest, unremarkable, covered in scrub and shepherds' huts. And yet, from this unlikely beginning would emerge a power so vast, so enduring, so deeply woven into the foundations of the modern world, that 2,000 years later, we still measure our calendars by its emperors, speak languages descended from its tongue, and walk on roads laid by its engineers. This is the story of Rome. Not merely a city, not merely an empire, but a single continuous thread of human ambition that stretched across 22 centuries, from a shepherd's village to a republic, from a republic to the mightiest empire the ancient world had ever known, and from that empire's slow collapse in the West to its extraordinary survival in the East, where it endured for another 1,000 years under a different name, in a different world, until one final morning in May of 1453 when the very last ember of Rome was extinguished. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It is always a comfort to see how many corners of the world come together in these quiet evenings. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Wolf and the Twins. Rome's mythical origins and the Age of Kings. 753 to 509 BCE. Every great civilization tells a story about its own beginning, and the story Rome told about itself was one of abandonment, survival, and violence woven into destiny from the very first breath. According to legend, and we must be careful here to separate legend from what little evidence survives, twin brothers named Romulus and Remus were born to a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, who claimed the god Mars himself as their father. Their great-uncle, a usurper king named Amulius who had stolen the throne of the nearby city of Alba Longa from their grandfather, saw the infants as a threat to his power. He ordered them drowned in the Tiber River. The servant tasked with this cruelty could not bring himself to complete it. He placed the infants in a basket and set them adrift on the rising floodwaters instead, perhaps hoping nature would absolve him of the killing. The basket caught in the roots of a fig tree near the base of the Palatine Hill. And there, according to the legend that Romans would tell their children for the next 1,000 years, a she-wolf found the crying infants and nursed them as her own. A woodpecker, sacred to Mars, brought them food. A shepherd named Faustulus discovered them sometime later and raised them as his own sons, never knowing, or perhaps suspecting but never confirming, that he was raising the grandsons of a deposed king. The twins grew into formidable young men, eventually learning the truth of their birth, restoring their grandfather to his throne, and setting out to found a city of their own on the hills where they had been saved. But destiny, even in legend, rarely unfolds without conflict. The brothers quarreled, over which hill to build upon, over who would be king, over the boundaries of the new settlement. In the most famous version of the story, Remus mocked his brother's newly built walls by leaping over them, and Romulus, in a fury that Roman historians would later treat as both a crime and a founding necessity, killed him. Romulus became the first king of a city he named after himself, Roma. The traditional date given for this founding, and Romans took this date with surprising seriousness, building their entire calendar system around it, was 753 BCE. What do we actually know, setting legend aside? Archaeological evidence tells a more gradual and less dramatic story, though no less remarkable in its own way. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have revealed traces of simple huts dating to roughly the 8th century BCE, suggesting that small pastoral communities did indeed exist on these hills around the time the legend claims. Rome was not born in a single day from a single founding act, but emerged slowly as villages on the 7 hills: the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Celian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Quirinal, gradually merged into a single, unified settlement. This location was not accidental. The site sat at a natural crossing point of the Tiber River, along an ancient salt route connecting the coast to the interior of Italy. It was close enough to the sea to participate in Mediterranean trade, yet far enough inland to be defensible against raids from pirates and rival coastal powers. The 7 hills themselves offered natural fortification, and the surrounding region, Latium, was populated by Latin-speaking peoples who shared cultural and religious traditions, creating a foundation of shared identity that the early Romans could draw upon. For its first 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, 7 of them according to traditional Roman history, though the historical reliability of these accounts decreases the further back we go. The early kings were said to be Latin or Sabine, reflecting Rome's origins as a melting pot of neighboring peoples. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was credited with establishing many of Rome's foundational religious institutions: the priesthoods, the sacred calendar, the cult of Vesta with her eternal flame tended by virgin priestesses. Tullus Hostilius, the third king, was remembered as a warlike ruler who destroyed the rival city of Alba Longa and absorbed its population into Rome, a pattern of conquest and absorption that would define Roman expansion for the next 1,000 years. But the most consequential period of the monarchy came with its final 3 kings, who were not Latin at all but Etruscan. The Etruscans were a sophisticated civilization centered in the region north of Rome, in modern Tuscany. Their very name survives in that region's title. They were skilled metalworkers, accomplished engineers, and practiced a religion deeply concerned with divination, the reading of omens in the flight of birds, the shape of lightning, and the entrails of sacrificed animals. When Etruscan kings took control of Rome, whether through conquest, marriage alliance, or some combination historians still debate, they brought with them an entire toolkit of urban civilization that the relatively rustic Latin settlement had not yet developed. Under Etruscan rule, Rome transformed. The Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer system, was constructed to drain the marshy valley between the hills, turning it into the Forum, the political, religious, and commercial heart of the city for the next 1,000 years. Stone temples replaced simple wooden shrines. The city was fortified with proper walls. Etruscan religious practices, including the reading of omens by specialized priests called augurs, were absorbed into Roman state religion so thoroughly that Romans would continue consulting the flight patterns of birds before major decisions for centuries to come, long after they had subjugated and absorbed the Etruscan civilization itself. The last king of Rome was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Roman tradition remembers him as a tyrant, a man who seized the throne through murder, ruled through fear rather than law, and surrounded himself with armed guards because he trusted no one. Whether this portrait is historically accurate or whether it was shaped by later generations who needed a villain to justify the revolution that followed is a question without a definitive answer. What we do know is that around 509 BCE, a crisis erupted that the Romans would remember as the founding trauma of their entire political identity. The story, as the Romans told it, involved Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, who raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman. Unable to bear the shame, Lucretia revealed the crime to her husband and father, extracted a promise of vengeance, and then took her own life in front of them. Her death became the spark that ignited rebellion. Led by a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, an ancestor, the Romans would later claim, of the man who would assassinate Julius Caesar 5 centuries later, the Roman aristocracy rose up, expelled the Tarquin family, and swore a solemn oath that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. This was not merely a change of government. It was the birth of a political ideology that would define Roman identity for the next half-millennium and beyond. The word for king, rex, became almost a curse word in Roman political vocabulary. Ambitious men who seemed to be reaching for kingly power, even centuries later, could be accused of wanting to be rex, and the accusation alone could destroy a political career or end a life. The trauma of monarchy, real or embellished by later storytelling, became the founding myth of something new, the Roman Republic. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Republic. Conquest, Law, and the Punic Wars, 509 to 146 BCE. What the Romans built to replace kingship was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkable political invention. Power was divided, deliberately and obsessively, to prevent any single individual from ever again accumulating the kind of unchecked authority that Tarquin had wielded. At the head of the state stood 2 consuls, elected annually, each holding equal power and each capable of vetoing the other's decisions. This built-in check meant that no consul could act alone in any major matter without his colleagues' agreement, a structural safeguard against tyranny that came at the cost of occasional paralysis. Below the consuls sat a complex hierarchy of other elected offices: praetors who administered justice, quaestors who managed finances, aediles who oversaw public works and games, and eventually censors who conducted the census and oversaw public morality. Each office had a defined term, almost always just 1 year, and a defined set of powers. This system, known as the cursus honorum, the course of honors, became the career ladder that ambitious Roman men climbed throughout their lives, each office a stepping stone toward the ultimate prize of the consulship. Looming over all of these elected magistrates was the Senate, a body of several hundred former officeholders who served for life and whose collective wisdom, auctoritas, the Romans called it, a word meaning something between authority and prestige, guided Roman policy even though the Senate technically only had advisory power. In practice, defying a unified Senate was nearly impossible for any ambitious Roman politician who hoped to have a future career. But Roman society in these early centuries was sharply divided between 2 classes, and this division would generate centuries of internal conflict. The patricians were the old aristocratic families, those who traced their lineage to the city's founding and who initially monopolized all political and religious offices. The plebeians were everyone else, the much larger population of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had no formal political voice despite forming the backbone of Rome's army and economy. This tension erupted into what historians call the conflict of the orders, a centuries-long struggle during which the plebeians gradually, through strikes, secessions, and sustained political pressure, won concession after concession from the patrician elite. They won the right to elect their own officials, called tribunes, who held the unique power to veto any action by the government that harmed plebeian interests. They won the codification of Roman law into the 12 tables around 450 BCE, ensuring that legal rules were publicly known rather than existing only in the memories of patrician judges who could interpret them however served their own interests. They eventually won the right to hold the consulship itself, and by 287 BCE, with the passage of the Lex Hortensia, plebeian assemblies gained the power to pass laws binding on the entire Roman state, patrician and plebeian alike. This gradual, often grudging expansion of political rights, achieved not through revolutionary violence but through sustained pressure and negotiated compromise, created a political culture remarkably resilient compared to many of its neighbors. Romans developed an almost religious devotion to law, precedent, and constitutional process, even as the practical distribution of wealth and influence remained deeply unequal. While Rome resolved its internal conflicts, it was simultaneously engaged in a centuries-long process of military expansion across the Italian peninsula. This was rarely glorious conquest in the way later Roman propaganda would suggest. It was slow, grinding, often brutal warfare against other Latin peoples, against the Etruscans to the north, against fierce mountain tribes like the Samnites to the south, and eventually against the Greek city-states that had colonized southern Italy centuries earlier. The Roman approach to conquered peoples proved to be one of their most important innovations, arguably more significant to their ultimate success than any military tactic. Rather than simply enslaving or exterminating defeated enemies, as many ancient powers did, Rome typically offered a path toward integration. Defeated peoples could become Roman allies, retaining significant local autonomy while providing troops for Roman armies and following Roman foreign policy. Some communities were granted partial or even full Roman citizenship. Roman colonies were established throughout conquered territory, spreading Roman language, law, and culture while simultaneously serving as strategic strongholds. This system, which modern historians call the Roman Confederation, meant that by the time Rome finished unifying the Italian peninsula in the early 3rd century BCE, it commanded not merely its own citizens but a vast network of allied and incorporated peoples who, whatever their original feelings about Roman conquest, now had a genuine stake in Rome's continued success and military victories. This gave Rome access to manpower reserves that simply dwarfed those available to any single Mediterranean rival. That manpower reserve would prove essential when Rome encountered the greatest challenge of its early history: Carthage. Carthage was an ancient Phoenician trading city on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, and by the 3rd century BCE it had built a maritime trading empire that dominated the western Mediterranean. Carthaginian merchant ships controlled trade routes throughout the region. Carthaginian colonies dotted the coasts of Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. When Roman and Carthaginian interests collided over control of Sicily, the result was the First Punic War, beginning in 264 BCE, the first of 3 devastating conflicts that would consume the better part of a century and determine which civilization would dominate the Mediterranean world. Rome, a land power with little naval tradition, was forced to build a war fleet essentially from scratch, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian ship as a template to copy. Roman innovation, including a boarding device called the corvus that allowed Roman soldiers to fight Carthaginian sailors in the close-quarters combat, where Roman legionaries held the advantage, eventually overcame Carthaginian naval superiority. The First Punic War ended in 241 BCE with a Roman victory, forcing Carthage to abandon Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. But this was merely the opening act. The Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BCE, produced one of the most legendary military campaigns in human history. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, driven by a hatred of Rome that his father had reportedly instilled in him from childhood, led an army that included war elephants across the Alps into Italy itself, a logistical achievement so extraordinary that it remained a subject of military study more than 2,000 years later. Hannibal proceeded to inflict catastrophic defeats on Roman armies, most devastatingly at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon, one of the bloodiest days in the history of ancient warfare. Rome, by any reasonable calculation, should have collapsed after Cannae. Instead, in a demonstration of the resilience that the Confederation system had built, Rome's Italian allies largely remained loyal. New legions were raised again and again despite catastrophic losses, and Roman strategy shifted toward avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal while wearing down his forces and isolating him from reinforcement. Eventually, a Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war directly to Carthage's territory in North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home to defend his city. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio, who would be honored with the title Africanus for this achievement, decisively defeated Hannibal, ending the Second Punic War and breaking Carthaginian power permanently. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, was less a war than a deliberate annihilation. Rome, no longer facing any genuine military threat from a thoroughly weakened Carthage, manufactured pretexts for renewed conflict and besieged the city itself. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BCE, the Romans did not merely defeat their old rival, they destroyed it. The city was burned, its population enslaved or killed, and according to later tradition, salt was sown into the earth to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. Whether this final detail is historical fact or symbolic legend, the underlying reality was undeniable. A civilization that had rivaled Rome for control of the Mediterranean had been erased from existence. In that same year, 146 BCE, Rome also destroyed the Greek city of Corinth, crushing resistance in Greece and establishing dominance over the eastern Mediterranean as well. Rome, which had begun as a collection of huts on 7 hills beside a muddy river, now stood as the unchallenged master of the entire Mediterranean world. Chapter 3. The Republic Devours Itself. Gracchi, Marius, and Sulla, 146 to 60 BCE. Victory, it turned out, was more dangerous to the Republic than any external enemy had ever been. The conquest of the Mediterranean brought staggering wealth into Rome. Gold, slaves, art, and tribute flowing in from 100 conquered territories. But this wealth distributed itself with brutal unevenness. Roman senators and equestrians, the wealthy business class, used the chaos of conquest to acquire enormous landed estates called latifundia, often worked by the very slaves that conquest had supplied in seemingly endless quantities. Meanwhile, the small farmers who had traditionally formed the backbone of the Roman army found themselves squeezed out, their modest farms unable to compete with slave-worked megaestates, their long years of military service leaving their land neglected and vulnerable to acquisition by wealthier neighbors. This created a growing class of landless, often desperate citizens flooding into Rome itself, a volatile population with grievances and, crucially, with the political franchise to act on those grievances. Into this tension stepped 2 brothers whose attempts at reform would shatter, perhaps permanently, the unwritten rules that had allowed the Republic to function for centuries. Tiberius Gracchus, elected as a tribune of the plebeians in 133 BCE, proposed legislation to redistribute public land technically owned by the state but long since occupied and effectively privatized by wealthy senators, to landless citizens. This was not, by any objective measure, a radical proposal. It largely sought to enforce existing legal limits on landholding that had simply been ignored for generations. But to the senatorial elite who had built their fortunes on these very lands, it represented an existential threat to their wealth and status. When Tiberius pushed his legislation through the popular assembly despite Senate opposition, itself a controversial use of constitutional procedure, and then sought re-election as tribune in a move that violated unwritten political norms even if it broke no actual law, a group of senators, led by the Pontifex Maximus himself, took matters into their own hands. They beat Tiberius Gracchus to death with clubs and chair legs, along with hundreds of his supporters, and threw his body into the Tiber River, denying him even the dignity of proper burial. This was the first instance of large-scale political violence in Roman domestic politics in centuries, and it shattered something that could not be easily repaired. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, pursued even more ambitious reforms as tribune, including extending citizenship rights and establishing grain subsidies for the urban poor. He, too, was eventually declared an enemy of the state by the Senate and died, by some accounts at his own hand, by others killed by his pursuers, along with thousands of his supporters in renewed political violence. The lesson absorbed by an entire generation of ambitious Roman politicians was unmistakable and corrosive. The old rules of gradual compromise and respect for constitutional norms could be abandoned when the stakes felt high enough. Violence had entered the Roman political bloodstream, and it would not easily be removed. Into this destabilized environment rose a new kind of Roman leader, one whose power derived not primarily from traditional aristocratic prestige but from military command and the personal loyalty of soldiers. Gaius Marius, a man of relatively undistinguished family background who rose through sheer military competence, transformed the Roman army during his unprecedented 7 terms as consul. Facing a manpower crisis, Marius opened military recruitment to landless citizens who had previously been ineligible for service, equipping them at state expense and offering the prospect of land grants upon retirement. This reform solved Rome's immediate military challenges, allowing Marius to defeat dangerous invasions by Germanic tribes that had threatened Italy itself. But it created a profound and ultimately fatal structural problem. Soldiers' loyalty increasingly attached not to the abstract Roman state, but to the specific general who recruited them, paid them, and promised them land. Armies were becoming personal instruments of ambitious commanders rather than servants of the Republic. This dynamic produced a bitter rivalry between Marius and another brilliant general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a rivalry that escalated until Sulla did something no Roman general had previously dared. He marched his own army against Rome itself, treating the sacred boundary of the city as no obstacle to his political ambitions. After years of civil war, proscriptions, and brutal purges of political enemies, Sulla published lists of citizens who could be killed on sight with their property confiscated by whoever killed them. Sulla had himself declared dictator, an emergency office traditionally limited to 6 months that he held for an unprecedented and deeply troubling indefinite term. Sulla eventually voluntarily retired from his dictatorship, an act that surprised contemporaries and which he perhaps intended as a demonstration of restraint. But the precedent he had established was catastrophic for the long-term health of the Republic. A sufficiently powerful and ruthless general, commanding sufficiently loyal troops, could simply seize control of the entire Roman state through force, override traditional constitutional limits, and dictate terms to the Senate and the people alike. The Republic had survived Sulla, but the principle that had protected it for centuries, that no individual stood above the law and the collective decisions of Rome's institutions, had been irrevocably broken. The stage was now set, terribly and almost inevitably, for the rise of men who would finish what Sulla had begun. Chapter 4. The Man Who Broke the Republic. Caesar, Civil War, and the End of an Era, 60 to 27 BCE. History rarely offers a figure as endlessly fascinating, as genuinely brilliant, and as ultimately consequential as Gaius Julius Caesar. Born into a patrician family that claimed, with characteristic Roman comfort in blending myth and lineage, direct descent from the goddess Venus herself through the legendary Trojan hero Aeneas, Caesar's early career gave little indication of the scale of ambition that would eventually reshape the entire Mediterranean world. He was, by most accounts, an unusually talented orator, a man of considerable personal charm, and notoriously, even scandalously generous with borrowed money, accumulating debts that would have ruined a lesser politician but that Caesar always seemed to escape through some combination of charisma, calculated risk, and sheer audacity. His political rise followed the traditional cursus honorum, climbing through successive magistracies, but he distinguished himself early through theatrical and sometimes legally questionable methods of building popular support: extravagant public games funded through enormous debt, prosecutions of corrupt officials that won him popularity among ordinary citizens even as they earned him enemies among the elite, and a genuine talent for positioning himself as a champion of the common people against an increasingly insular and self-protective senatorial aristocracy. In 60 BCE, Caesar formed an informal political alliance, later called the First Triumvirate by historians, though the Romans themselves never used such an official term, with two other powerful men. Pompey the Great, the most celebrated military commander of his generation, who had won extraordinary victories across the eastern Mediterranean, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputedly the wealthiest man in Rome, who had made his fortune partly through ruthless real estate speculation during Sulla's proscriptions. Together, these three men effectively controlled Roman politics for nearly a decade, securing for Caesar the consulship and, crucially, a 5-year military command in Gaul that would transform him from a promising but financially troubled politician into one of history's most celebrated military commanders. The Gallic Wars, which Caesar himself documented in commentaries that remain remarkably readable today, nearly 2,000 years later, were a campaign of staggering scale and brutality. Over roughly 8 years, Caesar's legions subdued the various Celtic tribes of Gaul, encompassing roughly modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. Caesar's own estimates, almost certainly inflated for propaganda purposes but reflecting a genuine and horrifying scale of violence, claimed that out of a Gallic population of perhaps 3 million, 1 million died in the fighting and another million were enslaved. These campaigns made Caesar enormously wealthy through plunder and enslaved captives, built him an army of intensely loyal veteran soldiers who had fought alongside him for nearly a decade, and made him, through his vivid and self-promoting written accounts sent back to Rome, one of the most famous men in the Mediterranean world. But this success also generated profound anxiety among Rome's traditional aristocracy, and particularly within an increasingly suspicious Senate, about what Caesar intended to do with his army, his wealth, and his popularity once his Gallic command finally expired. The death of Crassus in a disastrous military campaign against the Parthian Empire in 53 BCE removed the third member of the triumvirate and left Caesar and Pompey as the two dominant figures in Roman politics, their alliance increasingly strained by mutual suspicion and by the maneuvering of senators who saw an opportunity to use one against the other. When the Senate, pressured by Pompey and by Caesar's enemies, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would have left him legally vulnerable to prosecution for various irregularities in his earlier political career, and stripped him of the protection his military command provided. Caesar faced an impossible choice. In January of 49 BCE, Caesar led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary marking the edge of Italy proper, where Roman law strictly forbade any general from bringing armed troops without explicit Senate authorization. This act, deliberately and knowingly illegal, meant there could be no peaceful resolution. Caesar reportedly remarked, in a phrase that has echoed through more than 2,000 years of subsequent history as shorthand for any irreversible decision, "Alia iacta est." The die is cast. The civil war that followed, fought across Italy, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain over the course of several years, ultimately resulted in decisive victory for Caesar. Pompey, defeated at the climactic Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, fled to Egypt seeking refuge, only to be murdered by agents of the Egyptian court who hoped, incorrectly as it turned out, that presenting his head to Caesar would earn Egyptian favor with the apparent victor. Caesar's subsequent visit to Egypt produced one of history's most famous political and romantic alliances, with the young Egyptian Queen Cleopatra VII, whose own political position was precarious amid internal Egyptian court conflicts. Their relationship, which produced a son named Caesarion, was simultaneously a genuine personal connection and a calculated political alliance, securing Egyptian support and resources for Caesar while securing Caesar's military backing for Cleopatra's hold on her throne. Having eliminated his rivals and secured control over the entire Roman world, Caesar returned to Rome and began implementing an ambitious program of reforms, reorganizing the calendar into the system that, with modifications we still use today, expanding citizenship rights to provincial communities, launching massive public building projects, and addressing the chronic debt crisis that had destabilized Roman society for generations. He was declared dictator, initially for limited terms but eventually, in early 44 BCE, for life, dictator perpetuo, an unprecedented and deeply alarming concentration of permanent personal power that struck at the very heart of everything the Republic claimed to stand for. For many senators, particularly those who still held genuine ideological commitment to republican governance rather than mere personal grievance, Caesar's accumulation of permanent power represented an existential threat to the political system their ancestors had built 5 centuries earlier upon the expulsion of the kings. A conspiracy formed, led by Marcus Junius Brutus, who, in one of history's more poignant ironies, traced his lineage to the very Brutus who had expelled Tarquin the Proud and founded the Republic, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, eventually drawing in dozens of senators who believed, with what they considered genuine conviction, that they were saving Rome from a return to monarchy. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of March in 44 BCE, the conspirators surrounded Caesar in the Senate House and stabbed him to death, reportedly inflicting 23 wounds. Caesar's final words, according to various ancient sources, remain disputed. The famous Et Brute comes not from any contemporary account but from William Shakespeare's play written more than 16 centuries later, though it has become so culturally embedded that many assume it historical. The conspirators believed, with what proved to be catastrophic naivety about the political forces they had unleashed, that removing Caesar would simply restore the traditional republic. Instead, his assassination plunged Rome into another round of devastating civil war, as Caesar's adopted heir, his great-nephew Octavian, allied initially with Caesar's loyal lieutenant Mark Antony, hunted down and eliminated the conspirators one by one, with Brutus and Cassius both eventually taking their own lives after military defeat. Octavian and Antony, along with a third figure named Marcus Lepidus, then formed a second triumvirate, this one given actual legal sanction by the Senate, effectively dividing control of the Roman world between them. But this alliance, like the first, proved unstable, particularly as Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, now genuinely passionate as well as politically calculated, deepened, and as Antony increasingly governed the Eastern Mediterranean in a style that Octavian's propaganda machine in Rome portrayed as dangerously un-Roman, even as a betrayal of Roman values in favor of decadent Egyptian luxury and foreign influence. The final confrontation came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general and close friend Marcus Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria the following year, both took their own lives rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as conquered enemies. With Antony and Cleopatra dead, and with Caesarion, Caesar's son by Cleopatra, executed on Octavian's orders to eliminate any potential rival claim to Caesar's legacy, Octavian stood as the sole and unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. The civil wars that had consumed Rome for the better part of 2 decades, the culmination of a century of escalating political violence that had begun with the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, had finally ended. the Roman Republic, which had endured for nearly 500 years since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud, was, in every meaningful sense, finished, even though its outward forms, its Senate, its consuls, its ancient offices, would persist in increasingly hollow form for centuries to come. What emerged from these ashes would be something genuinely new in human history. Chapter 5: The First Emperor. Augustus and the Birth of the Pax Romana, 27 BCE, 14 CE. Octavian understood something that Caesar, for all his brilliance, had perhaps failed to fully grasp. Romans, despite the practical reality of one-man rule that recent decades had repeatedly demonstrated, retained a deep and genuine ideological attachment to the forms and language of the Republic. Calling oneself dictator, as Caesar had, or king, the word Romans had hated for 5 centuries, invited assassination. Octavian chose a different path entirely. In 27 BCE, in a carefully orchestrated political theater, Octavian formally offered to relinquish all his extraordinary powers and restore full authority to the Senate and the Roman people. The Senate, in turn, performing its own carefully scripted role in this elaborate political dance, begged him to retain command of the provinces and the armies for the good of Roman stability. Octavian graciously accepted this request, and the Senate bestowed upon him the title Augustus, meaning something like the revered one or the one favored by the gods. A name with profound religious connotations, but, crucially, no explicit monarchical implications. This was the genius of what Augustus constructed: a system of personal autocratic rule disguised, with elaborate and deliberate care, in republican clothing. He never called himself king or even emperor in any formal sense. That title, imperator, originally meant simply victorious general, and only gradually accumulated its later monarchical meaning through Augustus's own use of it. He held the title princeps, first citizen or first among equals, suggesting merely that he was the most distinguished member of a still-functioning Senate rather than its master. In practice, of course, Augustus held absolute power. He controlled the vast majority of Rome's legions through direct personal command of the most important provinces. He held permanent tribunician power, giving him the ability to veto any legislative action, without ever actually holding the office of tribune itself. He controlled state finances, religious institutions, and through his enormous personal wealth and patronage networks, effectively determined who could rise through political office at all. But by maintaining the outward forms, the Senate continued to meet, consuls continued to be elected, ancient offices continued to exist. Augustus offered the Roman elite a face-saving fiction that allowed them to accept, however reluctantly, what amounted to permanent one-man rule. This system, modern historians call the Principate, succeeded where Caesar's more blatant approach had failed, partly because of Augustus's own genuine political skill and patience, and partly because, after a century of escalating civil war and political violence, most Romans, exhausted by chaos and bloodshed, were simply ready to accept stability under almost any terms, even at the cost of genuine political liberty. And stability, on a scale the Mediterranean world had rarely if ever experienced, is precisely what Augustus's 41-year reign delivered. The period inaugurated by his rule came to be called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a roughly 2-century span during which, despite occasional frontier wars and isolated rebellions, the core territories of the Roman world experienced unprecedented internal stability, allowing trade, agriculture, urban development, and cultural production to flourish on a scale that would not be matched again in Europe for well over 1,000 years. Augustus used this stability and his vast personal resources to transform Rome itself, famously claiming, with characteristic rhetorical flair, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Magnificent new temples, forums, theaters, and public buildings reshaped the urban landscape. He patronized literature on an extraordinary scale, supporting poets like Virgil, whose epic poem The Aeneid linked Rome's destiny directly back to the mythical Trojan hero Aeneas, weaving together Rome's legendary past with Augustus's own contemporary political project in a work of staggering literary ambition that remains a cornerstone of Western literature more than 2,000 years later. He reformed the army into a permanent professional standing force, with fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement benefits, finally resolving the chronic instability that had plagued the late Republic, where soldiers' loyalty had attached to individual generals rather than to the state itself. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite force charged with protecting the emperor personally, though this institution would, in later centuries, prove to be as much a threat to emperors as a protection for them. He reorganized provincial administration, established a more efficient and less corrupt system of taxation, and created what amounted to history's first organized postal and communication network, connecting the vast territories under Roman control. Yet even Augustus, for all his careful political engineering, could not fully escape one of the fundamental and ultimately fatal weaknesses of the system he had created: the absence of any clear, universally accepted mechanism for succession. The old republic, whatever its flaws, had clear constitutional procedures for selecting leaders through annual elections. Augustus's quasi-monarchical system had no such clarity. He spent much of his later reign desperately trying to identify and prepare a successor, only to watch potential heirs die. His nephew Marcellus, his close friend and general Agrippa, his beloved grandsons Gaius and Lucius, through illness and misfortune that, to a suspicious Roman public, sometimes seemed conveniently timed for the ambitions of his wife Livia, whose own son from a previous marriage, Tiberius, would eventually inherit the throne. When Augustus finally died in 14 CE, after a reign that had transformed Rome from a chaotic, violence-racked republic into a stable, prosperous empire, the succession passed, not without controversy and lingering uncertainty about the legitimacy of hereditary rule in a state that still officially called itself a republic, to Tiberius. The precedent had been set, however imperfectly. Power would pass not through election, but through inheritance and personal designation, family connection, and sometimes naked political maneuvering. The age of the emperors had truly begun, and with it came challenges that would test whether this new system could survive contact with rulers far less disciplined and politically skilled than Augustus himself. Chapter 6: Blood and Marble. The Julio-Claudian emperors, 14 to 68 CE. The 54 years following Augustus's death would demonstrate, with often horrifying clarity, both the genuine administrative resilience of the system he had built and the profound dangers inherent in concentrating absolute power in the hands of individuals selected primarily through accident of birth rather than demonstrated capability. Tiberius, Augustus's chosen successor, proved to be a competent if deeply reluctant administrator, a man who, by most accounts, never genuinely wanted the position he inherited and who grew increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and eventually almost reclusive as his reign progressed. He spent his final years away from Rome entirely, ruling the empire from the island of Capri while delegating enormous and ultimately dangerous power to Praetorian prefect Sejanus, whose own ambitions for power eventually led to his downfall and execution when Tiberius belatedly recognized the threat his trusted lieutenant had become. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the throne passed to Caligula, a young man whose brief 4-year reign would become, in the historical memory that ancient sources have bequeathed to us, a byword for tyranny, cruelty, and outright madness. Whether Caligula was genuinely mentally unstable, as our admittedly hostile ancient sources insist, or whether he was simply a young and inexperienced ruler whose attempts to assert genuine autocratic authority, rather than maintaining Augustus's careful republican fictions, alienated the senatorial elite who later controlled the historical narrative, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. What is well documented is that Caligula's reign ended in 41 CE when officers of his own Praetorian Guard, the very force created to protect the emperor, assassinated him, along with his wife and infant daughter, in a coup driven partly by personal grievance and partly by broader elite fear of his increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. In the chaotic aftermath, with the Senate briefly and unrealistically debating whether to restore the actual republic, Praetorian Guard soldiers searching the palace reportedly discovered Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding in fear behind a curtain, and rather than killing him, declared him emperor instead, recognizing that a living emperor who owed his throne to their support represented a far better outcome for their own continued power and privileges than an uncertain return to republican governance. Claudius, widely underestimated throughout his life because of physical disabilities including a pronounced limp and speech impediment that contemporaries cruelly interpreted as signs of intellectual deficiency, proved to be a genuinely capable and historically significant administrator. His reign saw the successful conquest of Britain, beginning in 43 CE, the expansion of citizenship rights to provincial elites, significant reforms to imperial bureaucracy and legal administration, and major infrastructure projects including the construction of Rome's artificial harbor at Ostia, which would serve as the city's vital maritime lifeline for centuries. Claudius died in 54 CE under circumstances ancient sources widely attributed to poisoning, allegedly orchestrated by his own wife Agrippina the Younger, who wished to secure the succession for her son from a previous marriage, a young man who would take the name Nero and whose reign would become, alongside Caligula's, one of the most notorious in all of Roman history. Nero's early reign, guided substantially by capable advisors including the philosopher Seneca, showed genuine promise. But as Nero matured and grew increasingly resentful of restraint, he began systematically eliminating those who had guided or constrained him, including, in 59 CE, ordering the murder of his own mother Agrippina, whose ambitious political maneuvering had originally secured his throne. His reign became increasingly characterized by extravagant personal spending, theatrical self-indulgence including public performances as an actor and musician that scandalized traditional Roman aristocratic sensibilities, and an increasingly paranoid pattern of eliminating perceived rivals and critics. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which destroyed enormous portions of the city, became forever associated with Nero, despite the genuine historical uncertainty about whether he bore any actual responsibility for its outbreak. Ancient sources, hostile to Nero's memory, claimed he played the lyre while watching Rome burn, the origin of the enduring phrase about fiddling while Rome burns, though lyres rather than fiddles would have been the actual instrument of the era, and the entire anecdote may well be later invention. What is documented is that Nero used the fire's aftermath to seize substantial property for the construction of an enormous and extravagant new palace complex, and that he deflected public anger by blaming and brutally persecuting Rome's small Christian community, providing the new religious movement with its first major experience of organized state persecution. Nero's increasingly erratic rule eventually exhausted the patience of provincial governors, military commanders, and the Senate alike. Facing rebellion across multiple provinces and abandoned by the Praetorian Guard itself, Nero died by suicide in 68 CE, reportedly uttering the lament, "What an artist dies in me," a phrase perhaps more revealing of his self-perception than any other surviving record of his character. Nero's death without an heir plunged Rome into a chaotic year that history remembers, with grim accuracy, as the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, during which four different men, each backed by different legions and different provincial power bases, claimed the imperial throne in rapid and bloody succession. The eventual victor, a general named Vespasian who had been commanding Roman forces suppressing a major Jewish rebellion in Judea, finally restored stability, and established a new imperial dynasty, the Flavians, demonstrating both the resilience of the imperial system itself, capable of surviving even the catastrophic governance failures of Caligula and Nero, and its fundamental ongoing vulnerability to military intervention whenever legitimate succession mechanisms broke down entirely. Chapter 7. The Empire at its Zenith. The Five Good Emperors, 96 to 180 CE. After the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian provided roughly 3 decades of relative stability, marked by significant achievements including the construction of the Colosseum, begun under Vespasian and completed under Titus, and the brutal suppression of the Jewish rebellion in Judea, which culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. An event whose religious and historical consequences would echo for the next 2,000 years. But Domitian's increasingly paranoid and autocratic rule, reminiscent in some ways of Caligula and Nero before him, ended in his assassination in 96 CE, orchestrated by palace officials who feared they were next on his list of perceived enemies. What followed was something genuinely remarkable in the history of the Roman Empire, and indeed in the history of hereditary monarchical systems generally. A sustained period of nearly a century during which successive emperors, rather than relying on biological sons who might prove incompetent or unstable, instead adopted talented and experienced men as their heirs, selecting successors based on demonstrated administrative and military capability rather than mere accident of birth. This remarkable run began with Nerva, an elderly senator chosen by the conspirators who had killed Domitian specifically because his advanced age and lack of strong personal ambition made him a safe, transitional choice. Nerva's brief reign, lasting barely 16 months, mattered less for his own actions than for his crucial decision to adopt as his successor a highly respected military commander named Trajan, who was, notably, not even in Rome at the time but commanding legions on the German frontier. A clear signal that the army's loyalty and confidence mattered as much as senatorial approval in this delicate transitional moment. Trajan's reign, from 98 to 117 CE, marked the Roman Empire's greatest territorial extent in its entire history. A genuinely skilled military commander, Trajan conquered Dacia, roughly corresponding to modern Romania, commemorating this victory with the magnificent Trajan's Column in Rome, whose intricate spiral relief carvings depicting the campaign remain, nearly 2,000 years later, one of the most important surviving visual records of Roman military life and technology. He pushed Roman borders eastward into Mesopotamia, briefly bringing the empire to its absolute maximum territorial extent, encompassing roughly 2 million square miles and an estimated population of 50 to 90 million people, an almost unimaginable scale of governance for the technological capabilities of the ancient world. Trajan was succeeded, through adoption, by Hadrian, whose seemingly contradictory legacy combines genuine architectural and cultural achievement with a fundamental strategic reassessment of the empire's expansionist trajectory. Hadrian, recognizing that the empire had perhaps overextended beyond what could be practically defended and administered, withdrew from some of Trajan's eastern conquests and focused instead on consolidating and fortifying existing frontiers. His most famous and enduring monument, Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, stretching across 73 miles of difficult terrain, represented this defensive philosophy made permanent in stone. A clear physical statement that Rome's borders, however vast, had genuine limits. Hadrian was a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, deeply interested in Greek philosophy and architecture, who traveled more extensively throughout the empire's provinces than perhaps any emperor before or after him, personally inspecting frontier fortifications, provincial administration, and major construction projects. His personal life included a passionate relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous, whose mysterious death by drowning in the Nile led Hadrian to establish an entire religious cult in his memory, with cities named after him and his image reproduced in sculpture throughout the empire. A vivid demonstration of how personal imperial relationships could shape religious and cultural life across an entire civilization. The adoptive succession continued with Antoninus Pius, whose remarkably peaceful 23-year reign, from 138 to 161 CE, produced so little dramatic incident that ancient historians, accustomed to documenting wars, conspiracies, and crises, found relatively little of note to record, itself perhaps the highest possible compliment to an emperor's competent and stable governance. Antoninus, in turn, adopted as his successor a philosophically inclined senator named Marcus Aurelius, whose reign would mark both the philosophical and, in retrospect, the practical high point of this remarkable adoptive system. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, remains one of history's most genuinely compelling figures precisely because of the unusual survival of his private philosophical reflections, the Meditations, written largely during military campaigns and never intended for public circulation, offering an extraordinarily intimate window into the inner moral and psychological life of a Roman emperor grappling with the immense burdens and responsibilities of absolute power. His Stoic philosophy emphasized duty, self-discipline, and the importance of accepting circumstances beyond one's control with equanimity. Principles he attempted, with mixed but genuine success, to apply throughout a reign dominated by unprecedented challenges. These challenges were severe and unrelenting. Germanic tribes pressed with increasing aggression against the northern frontiers, requiring years of difficult and exhausting military campaigning that Marcus Aurelius, despite his philosophical temperament and evident preference for contemplative pursuits, conducted personally and largely successfully. A devastating plague, likely smallpox, swept through the empire beginning around 165 CE, killing an estimated 5 million people across the Roman world and severely straining administrative, military, and economic systems already stretched thin by simultaneous frontier wars. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, still campaigning against Germanic tribes on the Danube frontier, he broke the remarkable adoptive pattern that had served the empire so well for nearly a century, instead allowing his biological son Commodus to inherit the throne. This decision, whether driven by genuine paternal affection, by the practical political difficulties of bypassing a living son in favor of adoption, or by some combination of factors that ancient sources debate without clear resolution, would prove to be a catastrophic strategic error. Commodus's subsequent reign, marked by erratic governance, theatrical self-indulgence including personal participation in gladiatorial combat that scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities, and eventual assassination in 192 CE, plunged the empire back into the kind of succession crisis and civil war that the adoptive system had so successfully avoided for nearly a century. This nearly 100-year span, from Nerva's accession in 96 CE through Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 CE, would be remembered by later historians, including the influential 18th-century scholar Edward Gibbon, as the period during which the Roman Empire reached its absolute zenith, its greatest territorial extent, its most stable and competent governance, its highest degree of internal peace and prosperity, and arguably the closest any pre-modern empire ever came to combining vast scale with genuinely effective and relatively benevolent administration. Gibbon himself, in his monumental history of Rome's decline, famously suggested that if a person were required to choose the period in all of human history during which the human condition was happiest and most prosperous, they should unhesitatingly select this particular span of Roman history. But even at this moment of apparent maximum achievement, structural vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal were already becoming visible to careful observers. Chronic pressure along extended frontiers that strained military and financial resources, an economy still heavily dependent on slave labor and conquest-driven wealth that became increasingly difficult to sustain once major territorial expansion effectively ceased, and a succession system that, as Commodus's catastrophic reign would immediately demonstrate, remained ultimately dependent on the accident of individual character rather than any truly secure institutional safeguard against incompetent or destructive rule. Chapter 8. The Empire Breaks. The crisis of the 3rd century, 180 to 284 CE. What followed Marcus Aurelius's death and Commodus's chaotic reign was a century of such sustained crisis, fragmentation, and near collapse that modern historians simply call it the crisis of the 3rd century, a period during which the question of whether the Roman Empire would survive at all, in any recognizable form, remained genuinely uncertain for decades at a time. The proximate causes of this crisis were multiple and mutually reinforcing, creating a downward spiral that proved extraordinarily difficult to escape. Succession to the imperial throne, no longer governed by either clear hereditary principle or the adoptive merit system that had functioned so well for the previous century, increasingly became determined by simple military force, with whichever general commanded the most loyal and powerful legions able to seize power, regardless of any other claim to legitimacy. Between 235 and 284 CE, a period of roughly 50 years, the Roman Empire saw more than 20 different men claim the imperial throne, the vast majority dying through assassination, execution, or battlefield death rather than natural causes, an almost unimaginable rate of political instability at the very highest level of governance. This internal political chaos coincided disastrously with mounting external pressures along virtually every Roman frontier simultaneously. In the east, a newly aggressive Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, who had overthrown the previous Parthian rulers in 224 CE, proved a far more formidable and expansionist threat than their predecessors had been, repeatedly invading Roman territory in Mesopotamia and Syria. In one particularly humiliating episode in 260 CE, the Sassanid king Shapur I captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive in battle, reportedly using him as a literal human footstool and, according to some accounts, eventually having him executed in a manner designed for maximum symbolic humiliation, an almost unthinkable indignity for a Roman emperor that vividly illustrated how far imperial prestige and military capability had deteriorated. Along the northern and western frontiers, Germanic confederations including the Franks, the Alemanni, and the Goths launched increasingly frequent and devastating raids into Roman territory, sometimes penetrating deep into Gaul, Italy, and even Spain, territories that had not experienced direct military threat in centuries. The financial and administrative strain of fighting wars simultaneously on multiple distant frontiers, while also managing chronic internal political instability, proved nearly impossible to sustain through normal imperial mechanisms. The empire's economic system, meanwhile, was experiencing its own parallel crisis. Successive emperors, desperate for funds to pay increasingly mercenary and unreliable armies whose loyalty could no longer be assumed, repeatedly debased Roman coinage, reducing the actual silver content of denarii to a small fraction of their traditional value. This produced severe inflation that destabilized trade, taxation, and the basic economic relationships that had bound the vast Roman territories together for centuries. Some regions experienced such severe disruption that local economies reverted to barter, abandoning monetary exchange entirely in certain contexts. By the 260s CE, the strain on central imperial authority had become so severe that the empire effectively, if temporarily, fractured into three separate political entities. In the west, a breakaway state called the Gallic Empire, established by a Roman general named Postumus, controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain independently of central Roman authority for over a decade. In the east, the wealthy trading city of Palmyra, under its remarkable and fiercely ambitious Queen Zenobia, established control over Egypt and substantial portions of the eastern provinces, with Zenobia eventually declaring herself empress in direct and open defiance of Roman central authority. that the Roman Empire managed to survive this period of fragmentation and reunify, rather than permanently shattering into multiple successor states, as the Western Roman Empire would eventually do 2 centuries later under different circumstances, owes enormously to a remarkable series of capable, almost entirely military background emperors who emerged from the Balkan provinces during the crisis's later decades. These so-called Illyrian emperors, hardened career soldiers risen through the ranks rather than aristocratic senators, proved willing and able to do whatever brutal military work was necessary to restore imperial unity and frontier stability. Claudius too defeated a massive Gothic invasion. Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 CE and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, in a series of extraordinarily rapid and decisive military campaigns, reconquered both the breakaway Gallic Empire in the west and Zenobia's Palmyrene territories in the east, reuniting the fractured empire under central authority within just a few remarkable years. Aurelian also recognized that Rome's traditional borders had become increasingly indefensible against the new scale of barbarian incursion, constructing massive new walls around the city of Rome itself for the first time in centuries, itself a profound psychological and symbolic admission that even the empire's ancient capital was no longer automatically safe from external threat. Despite these genuine military achievements, the underlying structural problems that had produced the 3rd century crisis remained fundamentally unresolved. The empire desperately required not merely temporary military victories but comprehensive structural reform. Reform that would finally arrive in sweeping and historically transformative form with the accession of an emperor named Diocletian in 284 CE, whose reign would fundamentally restructure nearly every aspect of how the Roman Empire was governed, defended, and understood. Chapter 9. A New Rome. Diocletian, Constantine, and the Rise of Christianity, 284 to 337 CE. Diocletian, born to relatively humble origins in the Roman province of Dalmatia and risen through purely military achievement to the imperial throne, recognized with unusual clarity that the Roman Empire's fundamental problem was structural rather than merely a matter of individual leadership quality. The empire had simply grown too vast, its frontiers too extended, its administrative and military challenges too complex, for any single emperor, however capable, to effectively govern and defend alone. His solution, implemented in 293 CE, was a radical reorganization called the Tetrarchy, literally rule by 4. Diocletian divided supreme imperial authority between 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, each ruling roughly half the empire, and 2 junior emperors, called Caesars, who would assist their respective Augustus and, crucially, eventually succeed them through an orderly, prearranged transition rather than through the chaotic military coups that had characterized recent decades. Diocletian himself ruled the eastern portion of the empire, while his colleague Maximian governed the west, each supported by their designated Caesar successor. This system, whatever its theoretical elegance, addressed the empire's genuine administrative and military challenges with remarkable practical effectiveness, allowing multiple emperors to simultaneously address military threats and administrative needs across the empire's vast territory, rather than requiring a single ruler to constantly travel between distant and often simultaneous crises. Diocletian also implemented sweeping economic and administrative reforms, including a comprehensive new tax system, ambitious if ultimately only partially successful attempts at price controls intended to combat the chronic inflation of recent decades, and a substantial restructuring and expansion of the imperial bureaucracy. Diocletian is also remembered, less admirably from a modern perspective, for launching the most severe and systematic persecution of Christians in the empire's entire history, beginning in 303 CE. By this point, Christianity had grown from a small and marginal Jewish sect, viewed with suspicion partly because of its members' refusal to participate in traditional Roman civic religious rituals that bound communities together, into a substantial religious movement with adherents across virtually every social class and geographic region of the empire. Diocletian's persecution, ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and demanding sacrifice to traditional gods under threat of execution, would prove to be the empire's final, desperate, and ultimately catastrophically unsuccessful attempt to suppress what had become an unstoppable religious and social movement. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something almost without precedent in Roman imperial history. He voluntarily retired from power in apparent good health, retreating to a magnificent palace he had constructed in his native Dalmatia to cultivate vegetables, reportedly remarking to those who later begged him to resume the throne during subsequent political crises that they should see the magnificent cabbages he had grown with his own hands, a pointed suggestion that he had no interest whatsoever in returning to the burdens of imperial rule. But the tetrarchic system that Diocletian had so carefully constructed did not long survive his retirement, as competing ambitions among the various Augusti and Caesars, and crucially among their adult sons who felt entitled to succession by blood rather than the formal tetrarchic system of designated succession, plunged the empire into a renewed series of civil wars. From this chaotic competition eventually emerged a singularly transformative figure, Constantine, son of one of the original tetrarchic emperors, who would reunite the entire Roman Empire under his sole personal authority and, in doing so, fundamentally and permanently alter the trajectory of Western civilization. The pivotal moment in Constantine's rise came in 312 CE, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge near Rome, where he faced his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Empire. According to Constantine's own later account, and that of contemporary Christian historians who recorded his story, Constantine experienced a vision or dream before the battle instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol, and subsequently won a decisive victory that he attributed directly to the favor of the Christian God, rather than to the traditional Roman pantheon his predecessors had worshipped for centuries. Whatever the precise nature of Constantine's personal religious conviction, a subject ancient and modern historians continue to debate, given that he was not formally baptized until shortly before his death decades later, his political and legal actions following this victory would prove transformative beyond almost any other event in Roman religious history. In 313 CE, Constantine, along with his eastern co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, granting full legal toleration to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire for the first time, ending centuries of intermittent persecution and beginning a process that would, within just a few generations, transform Christianity from a persecuted minority faith into the empire's dominant religious and cultural force. Constantine personally provided enormous patronage for Christian institutions, funding the construction of major churches including the original Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, while also intervening directly in internal Christian theological disputes, most notably convening the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which sought to resolve a serious doctrinal controversy regarding the precise nature of Christ's divinity and produced the Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian theology still recited in churches throughout the world nearly 17 centuries later. Perhaps even more consequential for the long-term political and military history of the Roman world, Constantine made the historically momentous decision to establish a new imperial capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically positioned controlling the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean and Black Seas, formally dedicating this new city in 330 CE and naming it, with characteristic imperial modesty, after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This decision, whatever Constantine's precise motivations, whether primarily strategic, given the city's superb defensive position and its proximity to the increasingly important eastern frontiers, or partly symbolic, representing a fresh start unburdened by Rome's traditional pagan religious associations and senatorial political traditions, would prove to be one of the single most consequential decisions in the entire history of the Roman Empire. Constantinople would eventually become not merely an alternative capital, but the political, cultural, and religious center of an Eastern Roman state that would substantially outlive the Western Empire centered on Rome itself, surviving for over 1,000 years after the city of Rome had fallen to barbarian conquest. When Constantine died in 337 CE, having reigned longer than any emperor since Augustus himself and having fundamentally transformed both the empire's religious character and its geographic center of political gravity, he left behind a Roman world that, while still nominally unified, increasingly functioned as two distinct political and cultural spheres, a transformation that would become starkly, tragically clear within the following century, as the western and eastern halves of the empire experienced dramatically divergent fates. Chapter 10. The West Falls. Division, Invasion, and the End of an Empire, 337 to 476 CE. The decades following Constantine's death revealed, with increasingly stark clarity, that the unified Roman Empire he had bequeathed to his successors was becoming an administrative fiction increasingly difficult to sustain in practice. The empire's eastern and western halves faced fundamentally different geographic, economic, and military pressures, and the brief periods of genuine reunification under capable individual emperors became progressively less frequent and less durable as the 4th century progressed toward its close. The most decisively consequential moment in this gradual administrative separation came in 395 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius I, notable also as the emperor who finally made Christianity not merely tolerated but the official state religion of the Roman Empire, banning public pagan worship, died, dividing imperial authority between his two sons. Arcadius received the eastern half of the empire, centered on the increasingly prosperous and well-defended Constantinople, while the younger and considerably less capable Honorius received the western half, centered still on Rome, though the actual imperial capital had already begun shifting to more defensible northern Italian cities like Milan and eventually Ravenna. This division, while not necessarily intended by Theodosius as permanent, in practice never again reunified. From this point forward, the Eastern and Western Roman empires, while still considering themselves part of a single Roman civilization and occasionally cooperating militarily against shared external threats, functioned as genuinely separate political entities with separate emperors, separate administrations, and, crucially, dramatically diverging long-term trajectories of survival and collapse. The pressures that would eventually overwhelm the Western Empire had been building for generations, driven substantially by what historians call the migration period, a complex and prolonged movement of various Germanic peoples, themselves frequently displaced by pressure from nomadic groups moving westward from the Central Asian steppes into Roman territory. The most immediately consequential of these pressures came from the Huns, a fearsome nomadic confederation whose westward expansion during the late 4th century displaced numerous Germanic peoples, most significantly the Goths, who found themselves squeezed between Hunnic expansion to their east and the Roman frontier to their west. In 376 CE, facing Hunnic pressure they could not resist, large numbers of Gothic refugees, desperate and numbering perhaps in the tens of thousands, including substantial numbers of women, children, and elderly alongside warriors, sought permission to cross the Danube frontier and settle within Roman territory under Roman protection. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens granted this permission, but subsequent Roman administrative mismanagement, including widespread corruption and exploitation by local Roman officials charged with provisioning and managing the Gothic refugees, transformed what might have been successful integration into catastrophic conflict. The resulting Gothic War culminated in 378 CE at the Battle of Adrianople, where Gothic forces inflicted one of the most catastrophic defeats in the entire history of the Roman military, killing the Eastern Emperor Valens himself along with an estimated 2/3 of his army. This battle is frequently identified by historians as a crucial turning point, definitively demonstrating that Germanic peoples, when properly organized and sufficiently motivated, could decisively defeat even substantial Roman military forces. A lesson that various Germanic leaders would apply with increasing confidence and effectiveness over the following decades. The pressures continued building throughout the early 5th century with mounting severity. In 410 CE, a Gothic king named Alaric, after years of complex and ultimately failed negotiations with Roman authorities regarding promised payments, land settlements, and military commands, led his forces in the sack of Rome itself, the first time in approximately 800 years that the city, the original heart and symbolic center of the entire Roman civilization, had fallen to a foreign army. While the sack was, by the standards of ancient warfare, relatively restrained, with Alaric reportedly ordering his troops to respect Christian churches and avoid wholesale massacre, the psychological and symbolic impact across the Roman world was nonetheless profound and immediate, prompting the prominent Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo to write his monumental work City of God, partly in direct response to pagan critics who blamed Rome's abandonment of its traditional gods for this unprecedented catastrophe. The pressures intensified further with the arrival of the Huns themselves directly into Roman territory under their famous and fearsome leader Attila, whose campaigns throughout the 440s and early 450s devastated substantial portions of both the Eastern and Western empires, extracting enormous tribute payments and demonstrating the profound military vulnerability of Roman frontiers that had once seemed impregnable. Though Attila's death in 453 CE led to the relatively rapid disintegration of his confederation, the cumulative damage inflicted upon Roman military, economic, and administrative capacity throughout this period proved difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Throughout these mounting crises, the Western Roman imperial government, increasingly dominated behind the scenes by powerful Germanic generals, who commanded the loyalty of what remained of effective Roman military forces while puppet emperors occupied the formal throne with diminishing actual authority, struggled with chronic financial crisis, the loss of crucial tax-generating territories including substantial portions of North Africa to Vandal conquest in 439 CE, and an increasingly desperate reliance on Germanic foederati, Allied troops serving under their own commanders rather than integrated Roman military structures, for whatever military capability remained available. The final dissolution, when it came, arrived not with dramatic climactic battle but with almost bureaucratic anticlimax. In 476 CE, a Germanic military commander named Odoacer, commanding forces that included substantial numbers of Germanic mercenaries who had grown frustrated with inadequate compensation from an increasingly impoverished and ineffective imperial government, deposed the young and largely powerless Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus, whose name, with almost unbearable historical irony, combined that of Rome's legendary founder with a diminutive form suggesting his own essential insignificance. Rather than installing yet another puppet emperor as his predecessors had repeatedly done, Odoacer instead sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, formally acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as sole legitimate Roman emperor while ruling Italy himself as a king under nominal Eastern Roman authority. This act, whether or not contemporaries fully recognized its ultimate historical significance at the time, effectively marked the end of any continuous independent Western Roman imperial government, an institution that had governed, in various forms, for well over 1,000 years since the legendary founding of the city itself. The Western Roman Empire, then, did not so much fall in any single dramatic moment as gradually dissolve over the course of decades, its territories progressively absorbed into various Germanic successor kingdoms, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths and later Lombards in Italy, Vandals in North Africa, Franks in Gaul, Anglo-Saxons in Britain, each combining elements of Roman administrative, legal, and cultural tradition with their own distinct Germanic political structures and customs, creating the foundational political landscape from which medieval and eventually modern European nations would eventually emerge. Yet to characterize 476 CE as simply the end of Rome, as countless subsequent historical accounts have done, profoundly misrepresents the actual historical reality. For in the East, in the magnificent city Constantine had founded specifically to serve as a new Roman capital, the empire not only survived but would continue, in increasingly transformed but genuinely continuous form, for another full millennium. A civilization that considered itself, and was considered by its neighbors, to be authentically and continuously Roman, even as modern historians, requiring some convenient if somewhat artificial distinction, have come to call it Byzantine. Chapter 11. Rome Reborn in the East. Justinian and the Byzantine Golden Age, 476 to 565 CE. While the Western Roman Empire dissolved into competing Germanic successor kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on the magnificently fortified and strategically positioned city of Constantinople, not only survived the catastrophic pressures that had overwhelmed its Western counterpart but entered a period of substantial cultural, religious, and even, briefly, territorial revival under one of history's most consequential and ambitious rulers. Justinian I, who became Eastern Roman Emperor in 527 CE, possessed an explicit and deeply held conviction that he had been divinely chosen to restore the full territorial extent and unified glory of the ancient Roman Empire, reclaiming Western territories that had fallen under Germanic control during the previous century. This ambition, combined with genuine administrative talent and the crucial support of brilliant subordinates, would produce one of the most consequential reigns in the entire history of Roman civilization, Eastern or Western. Justinian's most enduringly significant achievement, in terms of lasting historical impact, was almost certainly his comprehensive codification of Roman law, a massive legal project undertaken by a commission of legal scholars led by the Juris Tribonian, which organized, clarified, and systematized centuries of accumulated and often contradictory Roman legal precedent into a coherent and comprehensive legal code. This corpus juris civilis, completed in stages throughout the 530s CE, would become the foundational basis for legal systems throughout continental Europe for the next 15 centuries, profoundly shaping concepts of property, contract, and civil procedure that remain embedded in many modern legal systems to this day. Justinian's reign also produced one of history's most architecturally significant achievements in the Hagia Sophia, a magnificent cathedral constructed in Constantinople following a devastating riot in 532 CE that had destroyed the previous church on the site along with substantial portions of the city itself. The new cathedral, completed in remarkably rapid time given its unprecedented scale and engineering ambition, featured a massive central dome that represented a genuine triumph of Byzantine architectural and engineering innovation, creating an interior space whose vast scale and intricate decoration was specifically designed to overwhelm visitors with a sense of divine majesty and imperial grandeur. Justinian himself, according to later tradition, upon entering the completed building for the first time, reportedly declared with characteristic and perhaps not entirely modest satisfaction, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," referencing the legendary biblical temple. Militarily, Justinian pursued his ambition of Western reconquest through brilliant generals, most notably Belisarius, whose campaigns achieved remarkable initial success, reconquering North Africa from the Vandals in a campaign lasting barely a year in 533 CE, and subsequently launching a far more prolonged and difficult campaign to reconquer Italy itself from the Ostrogoths, a conflict that would drag on for nearly 2 devastating decades and inflict catastrophic destruction upon the Italian peninsula, ironically devastating much of the very Roman heritage and infrastructure that Justinian's reconquest was nominally intended to restore and preserve. These military campaigns, while achieving genuine if ultimately temporary territorial success, placed enormous financial strain on the Eastern Roman treasury, strain that was further compounded by a catastrophic and historically significant outbreak of bubonic plague beginning in 541 CE. Subsequently named the Plague of Justinian by historians, which may have killed, according to various scholarly estimates that remain subject to ongoing debate and revision, between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world, representing perhaps a quarter or more of the entire regional population and constituting one of the most devastating pandemics in recorded human history prior to the later medieval Black Death. The combination of plague mortality, the enormous expense of prolonged military campaigns, and the underlying structural challenge of attempting to govern and defend reconquered Western territories from a distant Eastern capital meant that Justinian's Western territorial gains, however genuinely impressive as immediate military achievements, ultimately proved difficult to sustain in the longer term. Within just a few decades following Justinian's death in 565 CE, a new Germanic people called the Lombards would conquer substantial portions of the Italian peninsula that Belisarius had so painstakingly reconquered, while other reconquered territories would similarly prove vulnerable to renewed external pressure in subsequent generations. Yet despite these eventual territorial losses, Justinian's reign fundamentally established crucial patterns that would define Byzantine civilization for the following 9 centuries. An unwavering identification as authentically and continuously Roman despite increasingly using Greek rather than Latin as the dominant administrative and cultural language, a deep and inseparable fusion of imperial political authority with Orthodox Christian religious identity, and a remarkable civilizational resilience that would allow this Eastern Roman state to survive recurring waves of external pressure and internal crisis that would have completely destroyed less adaptable political systems. Chapter 12. The Long Survival. Byzantium through the centuries, 565 to 1204 CE. The centuries following Justinian's death tested Byzantine resilience through challenges of almost continuous severity, as the empire faced existential military threats from multiple directions simultaneously, while undergoing profound internal transformations that would, by the time these centuries concluded, leave Byzantine civilization looking dramatically different from its late Roman origins, even while its inhabitants continued to insist, with genuine conviction, on their authentic Roman identity. The 7th century proved particularly catastrophic, as a renewed and aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire launched devastating invasions that, at their height during the reign of Emperor Heraclius, captured Jerusalem itself in 614 CE, seizing what Christians believed to be the true cross on which Christ had been crucified, while Persian forces simultaneously campaigned deep into Byzantine Anatolia, bringing the empire to what many contemporaries genuinely believed was the verge of complete and final collapse. Heraclius's subsequent military campaigns, however, achieved a remarkable reversal, decisively defeating Persian forces and recovering the true cross by 628 CE, in what should have represented a triumphant restoration of Byzantine fortune. Instead, this Byzantine-Persian conflict, having catastrophically exhausted both empires' military and financial resources through decades of mutually devastating warfare, created precisely the conditions that allowed a genuinely unprecedented new force to emerge with explosive and historically transformative speed from the Arabian Peninsula. The rise of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad and the subsequent extraordinarily rapid Arab conquests following his death in 632 CE would permanently and fundamentally transform the entire geopolitical landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East within just a few astonishing decades. Byzantine forces, already severely weakened by the prolonged Persian wars, proved unable to effectively resist these new Arab-Muslim armies, losing the crucially important and wealthy provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt by the mid-7th century, territories that would never again return to Byzantine control. Arab forces even besieged Constantinople itself on multiple occasions, most seriously in 674 to 678 CE and again in 717 to 718 CE, with the city's survival on both occasions owing substantially to its formidable defensive walls, a devastating incendiary weapon called Greek fire whose precise chemical composition remains a historical mystery to this day, and, arguably, simple Byzantine determination and resilience under existential pressure. Having lost these enormously wealthy eastern and southern provinces permanently, the Byzantine Empire that emerged from this transformative 7th century crisis was considerably smaller in territorial extent than its late Roman predecessor, but also, in certain crucial respects, more internally cohesive and administratively streamlined, having shed some of the most religiously and ethnically diverse territories that had historically proven most difficult to govern and most prone to internal rebellion and dissent. The 8th and 9th centuries brought their own severe internal challenges, most notably the prolonged and genuinely traumatic religious controversy over iconoclasm, a sustained theological and political dispute over whether religious icons depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints constituted legitimate aids to Christian devotion or, alternatively, violated biblical prohibitions against idolatry. This controversy, which periodically erupted into actual destruction of religious artwork and persecution of icon supporters or opponents depending on which theological position imperial authority currently favored, profoundly divided Byzantine society for well over a century before icon veneration was definitively restored in 843 CE. Despite these substantial internal and external challenges, the Byzantine Empire achieved a genuine and sustained cultural, military, and economic revival during the period historians often call the Macedonian Renaissance, named after the imperial dynasty that ruled from 867 to 1056 CE. Emperors including Basil I, Basil II, and various capable successors achieved substantial military reconquest of previously lost territories, decisively defeated the powerful Bulgarian Empire that had repeatedly threatened Byzantine security, and presided over a substantial flowering of art, scholarship, and architecture that drew extensively and self-consciously upon the empire's ancient Greek and Roman heritage. Chapter 13, The Final Age. Catastrophe, Recovery, and the Fall of Constantinople, 1204 to 1453 CE. If the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE had wounded the Byzantine Empire grievously, the catastrophe that struck in 1204 CE would prove, in many crucial respects, far more devastating and arguably permanently fatal to any genuine prospect of full Byzantine recovery. The Fourth Crusade, originally organized with the stated intention of recapturing Jerusalem from Muslim control, became instead, through a complex sequence of financial debts, political manipulation, and escalating mutual distrust between Crusader leadership and Byzantine authorities, diverted toward an attack on Constantinople itself, fellow Christians, ostensibly allies in the broader struggle against Islamic expansion, turning their weapons instead against the greatest Christian city in the world. In April of 1204 CE, Crusader forces, composed primarily of French knights and Venetian naval forces motivated, substantially by simple greed for the city's legendary accumulated wealth, breached Constantinople's formidable defenses and subjected the city to a sack of horrifying brutality and destructiveness. For 3 days, Crusader forces pillaged Constantinople with a thoroughness and violence that shocked contemporary observers across both the Christian and Islamic worlds. Churches were stripped of sacred relics and precious metals. Libraries containing irreplaceable ancient manuscripts were destroyed or scattered, and the city's population suffered massacre, rape, and enslavement at the hands of forces who had, until very recently, been considered fellow Christians united in common religious and civilizational purpose. The bronze horses that still stand today in Venice, the magnificent porphyry sculptures, countless precious manuscripts and religious relics scattered throughout Western European churches and museums. All represent physical testament to this catastrophic plundering of accumulated Byzantine civilizational treasure. Following this devastating sack, the Crusaders established a so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, installing Western European nobles as rulers over fragmented Byzantine territory, while various Byzantine successor states, most significantly centered in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, continued to claim legitimate Byzantine imperial authority from their own respective territorial bases, creating a fragmented and weakened political landscape that would persist for nearly 6 decades. The Nicaean successor state eventually proved most successful in this fragmented competition, with its ruler Michael VIII Palaiologos recapturing Constantinople itself in 1261 CE and re-establishing a restored, if substantially diminished and permanently weakened, Byzantine imperial state. Yet this restored empire, despite formally reoccupying its ancient and symbolically vital capital, never approached anything resembling its former territorial extent, economic strength, or military capability. The 13th century catastrophe had inflicted wounds from which genuine full recovery proved permanently impossible. The final 2 centuries of Byzantine history, then, represent a prolonged, often genuinely poignant story of a once mighty empire reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and scattered, increasingly isolated territorial fragments, surrounded by emerging and increasingly powerful rivals, most consequentially an ambitious new Turkish power gathering strength in Anatolia. The Ottoman Empire, founded by a minor Turkish chieftain named Osman around 1299 CE, whose remarkable subsequent expansion would, within just a century and a half, reduce Byzantine territory to virtually nothing beyond Constantinople's own ancient walls. Successive Byzantine emperors, recognizing their empire's increasingly desperate strategic position, repeatedly appealed to Western European powers for military assistance against mounting Ottoman pressure, occasionally even offering, with considerable theological controversy and substantial domestic religious resistance, to formally reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for promised Western military support. These appeals produced only limited and ultimately inadequate assistance, as Western European powers, preoccupied with their own internal conflicts and harboring lingering historical suspicion toward Byzantine religious and political independence, proved unwilling to commit truly substantial military resources to Byzantine defense. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to Constantinople itself and a small surrounding territory, essentially a single fortified city attempting to resist the overwhelming military power of an Ottoman Empire that now controlled vast territories throughout Anatolia and the Balkans, possessing resources and manpower utterly incommensurate with the dramatically diminished Byzantine state attempting to resist Ottoman ambitions. The final Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, whose given name, with an almost unbearably poignant historical symmetry, matched that of the city's original imperial founder 11 centuries earlier, faced the ambitious young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who had explicitly and publicly declared his determined intention to finally capture Constantinople, a city that had successfully resisted numerous previous Islamic sieges extending back to the 7th century. Mehmed's siege, beginning in early April of 1453 CE, employed innovative and unprecedented military technology, most consequentially enormous bronze cannons specifically designed and cast to breach Constantinople's previously impregnable defensive walls that had successfully protected the city against every previous military challenge for over 1,000 years. Constantine XI, commanding a desperately outnumbered garrison that included some Genoese and Venetian volunteers alongside Byzantine defenders, but totaling perhaps only 7,000 or 8,000 men against an Ottoman besieging force numbering in the tens of thousands, refused multiple Ottoman offers of safe passage and surrender, choosing instead to remain and defend his ancient capital regardless of the increasingly evident hopelessness of ultimate Byzantine military prospects. After nearly 2 months of siege, on the fateful morning of May 29, 1453 CE, Ottoman forces finally breached Constantinople's walls through a combination of relentless artillery bombardment and sheer overwhelming numerical superiority. Constantine XI, according to traditional historical accounts, removed his imperial regalia and threw himself into the final desperate fighting alongside his remaining soldiers, choosing to die defending his city rather than survive its fall. His body never definitively identified amid the chaos and carnage of the city's final capture. With Constantinople's fall, an unbroken continuity of Roman imperial governance stretching back, in direct institutional lineage, to Augustus's establishment of the Principate nearly 1,500 years earlier, and, if one chooses to trace legendary origins back even further, to Romulus's foundation of the city of Rome itself in 753 BCE, finally and definitively ended. Mem II, entering his magnificently captured city, proceeded directly to the ancient Hagia Sophia, Justinian's magnificent architectural masterpiece, where he reportedly offered a brief prayer of Islamic thanksgiving before ordering the cathedral's conversion into a mosque, a powerful and symbolically resonant act marking the definitive transition of this ancient Roman and Christian capital into the new center of an expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire. The empire that Romulus had legendarily founded, that the Republic had expanded across the Mediterranean world, that Augustus had transformed into history's most enduring and influentially significant imperial system, and that had survived, in continuously adapting and transforming form, for nearly 22 centuries, had finally, definitively, and irreversibly come to its conclusion. Closing the eternal echo. What, then, do we make of 22 centuries? Of a civilization that began as huts on 7 muddy hills beside an unremarkable river, that expelled its kings and built a republic devoted, however imperfectly and inconsistently in actual practice, to the radical idea that no single man should rule unchecked, and that then, through its own internal contradictions and accumulated wealth, produced the very emperors whose absolute power it had once so violently rejected. Of an empire that conquered the known Mediterranean world through ruthless and often genuinely brutal military force, yet built roads, aqueducts, and legal systems whose basic engineering and conceptual principles remain in active use, in recognizable form, 2,000 years later. That gave humanity Cicero's eloquence and Caligula's cruelty, Marcus Aurelius's philosophical wisdom and Nero's theatrical excess, the genuine administrative brilliance of Augustus and the catastrophic civil violence of a century of assassinations. That watched its western half dissolve into competing Germanic kingdoms while its eastern half, transformed but never broken, persisted for another full 1,000 years, preserving classical learning, codifying Roman law into forms still taught in law schools today, and standing, often alone and always at tremendous cost, as a final eastern bulwark against successive waves of external pressure, until finally, on a May morning in 1453, the very last ember of an ancient and extraordinary civilizational flame was extinguished by Ottoman cannon fire. Yet to say Rome simply ended would profoundly misunderstand what actually happened. The Latin language fractured into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, living languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. Roman law underlies legal systems throughout continental Europe and much of the wider world. The very concept of a republic of checks and balances against concentrated power, however imperfectly the Romans themselves ultimately honored these principles in actual practice, profoundly shaped the political philosophy of later revolutionary movements, including, quite explicitly and self-consciously, the founders of the United States who looked back across nearly 2 millennia to Roman Republican models for political inspiration. The Colosseum still stands, weathered but unmistakable, in modern Rome. The Pantheon's magnificent dome, nearly 2,000 years old, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed, still functioning, still standing, still drawing visitors who walk beneath it in genuine awe. The Hagia Sophia, transformed from cathedral to mosque to museum and back to mosque again across the shifting centuries, still rises above modern Istanbul, a physical embodiment of Rome's extraordinary capacity to be transformed without being entirely erased. Perhaps this is the deepest and most enduring lesson embedded within Rome's extraordinarily long and complex story. That civilizations, however seemingly permanent and unshakable at their moments of greatest power and confidence, are never truly eternal in any simple sense. Yet their ideas, their innovations, their fundamental contributions to human civilization can echo forward across centuries and millennia in ways their original creators could never have fully anticipated or imagined. 22 centuries, compressed into a single quiet evening. An empire built from 7 hills, and from a single dream of permanence that, in its own profound and complicated way, very nearly came true. Now, as the night settles around you and this long story finds its resting place, let this be enough. Rome rose, Rome ruled, Rome fell, and Rome, in countless unexpected ways that surround us still, never entirely disappeared. Rest easy.